All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling the world of programming. But here's the twist. We're doing it all through one super cool webinar transcript. It's actually aimed at beginners, so it's perfect for breaking down those fundamentals. Even if you've got some coding experience, it's a great refresher. Plus, this webinar was seriously fun. The host was so energetic and conversational. We'll be sharing those insights and maybe even a few laughs along the way.
You know, it's interesting how relevant this topic is these days. Even if you aren't aiming to become a software engineer, understanding programming basics can be such an advantage in today's world.
Totally, it's everywhere, right? Okay, so the webinar kicks off with a definition of programming that's pretty spot on. They say programming is basically about giving instructions to a computer. Instead of doing things manually, you're teaching the computer how to do them for you. So it's all about problem solving, but with the help of a computer.
It's like creating a super detailed roadmap. Instead of a physical destination, you're guiding the computer towards a solution.
Oh, I like that analogy. And the webinar actually uses a similar one, navigating to a new place. Relying on instructions like turn left at the second light or go straight for 2 miles. Those instructions are essentially your code, telling the computer what to do.
And just like with directions, the order of those instructions is super important in programming. Change the order, and you might end up at the wrong destination. Or, in the case of code, you get a program that doesn't quite work as planned.
Makes sense. Speaking of order, the webinar gets into algorithms, using a scenario we all know, being hungry. They imagine you're hungry, so you check the fridge. If there's food, great, you decide to cook or order in. But if it's empty, you got to choose between grocery shopping or takeout.
I love how this highlights that branching aspect of algorithms. Just like in programming, each decision point leads to a different set of instructions, multiple paths, but ultimately, you reach the goal a satisfied stomach.
And just like with getting from point A to point B, there are often multiple ways to solve problems through code, which leads us to programming languages. The webinar explains them as different ways to write those instructions for the computer.
Think of it like translating a book. Same content, just expressed differently depending on the language.
They actually use that same analogy, a book in English, Spanish, German, and so on. Same story, different words and grammar.
And speaking of grammar, each programming language has its own set of rules. They're called syntax, essentially, the grammar of code. The webinar host also emphasizes that you shouldn't be scared off by that stereotypical programmer image. You know, the black screen and green text thing.
Right, they actually say, don't fear the black screen and green text. Programming isn't about secret rituals, it's about logic and clear instructions.
Exactly. It's systematic thinking, breaking down problems into smaller steps.
Before we get too deep into that, I think it's cool how the webinar shows how diverse programming is. We're talking web development, mobile apps, AI, data science, desktop applications, video games, even cybersecurity.
And what's fascinating is that despite all these different applications, they all rely on those same fundamental principles. Giving logical instructions to a computer, that's the core of it all.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The webinar actually includes a moment where a participant says they're feeling stuck in their career. They're thinking about switching to web development.
Oh, that's relatable. And how did the host respond to that?
They were super encouraging. They talked about how fast-paced and collaborative web development is, constantly evolving, new technologies popping up all the time.
It sounds like a pretty exciting field.
Definitely. I think it really resonates with that learner persona we talk about.
Oh, totally. Always eager to learn new things, explore new paths.
Exactly.
And even if someone isn't thinking about a career switch, understanding programming concepts is valuable. Expanding your skill set, opening up new possibilities, it's always a good thing.
So for those who are intrigued, the webinar lays out some practical steps for getting started.
All right, I'm all ears.
First up, practice that logical thinking through games. They mention Scratch and Code Wars. Scratch is visual, using blocks to represent code, so it's super easy to grasp those concepts without getting bogged down in syntax.
And Code Wars, that adds a fun, competitive element to it. Challenge yourself, test your skills against other coders. It sounds pretty engaging.
They also emphasize that coding isn't all about math skills. It's about logic and creativity, finding solutions.
Problem solving, right. I like that they highlight that.
They also recommend getting comfortable with being self-taught, relying on documentation. That's key.
That's so important, especially in tech where things change so quickly. It's not about memorizing everything. It's about knowing where to find information.
The webinar host actually gives this funny advice. Google is your friend.
That's so true, though. So many resources available online.
Exactly. And they talk about two main paths for learning formal education and informal learning. Formal would be like universities, more structured, broader knowledge, but longer time commitment.
And informal.
There'll be private institutions, online platforms, things like Udemy, Coursera, Codecademy.
Those are great for focused learning specific skills,
Right, and they offer more flexibility, self-paced learning.
which aligns perfectly with our learner persona, that efficiency and targeted approach.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of skills, the webinar emphasizes the demand for web developers. Locally and internationally, there's a real need.
That's great to hear. Knowing the job market, the possibilities, it adds another layer of motivation.
Okay, you ready for this? The webinar actually walks through a live coding example.
Ooh, this is where we see it all in action.
They decide to create a simple web page using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Classic first project.
Now, don't worry if you're not familiar with those yet. It's more about the big picture, the process.
Right, how the pieces fit together.
So, simply put, HTML provides the structure of the web page like the bones. CSS adds style, the visual appeal. And JavaScript brings the functionality, makes it interactive.
It's like building a house. HTML is the framework, CSS is the paint and decor, and JavaScript makes sure the lights work and the doors open.
I love that analogy. And the goal of this coding example is to make a button that displays a message when clicked.
Ah, the hello world of web development. Seems basic, but it illustrates those core programming principles beautifully.
Right. Define the problem greeting the user, then write the instructions to make it happen. So they start with an HTML button labeled Click Me. Then, using JavaScript, they write a function called Celudar to display the message using something called the alert function.
Now functions, those are like reusable building blocks in programming. Mini programs within the larger program.
Like prepackaged instructions, right?
Yeah.
So they create this Celudar function and link it to the button's on-click event.
So when the user clicks, that function springs into action.
Exactly. It's cause and effect within the code. Click the button, boom, the greeting pops up.
This really showcases that user interaction element. The program isn't just doing its own thing, it's responding to the user, creating a dynamic experience.
Totally. And to make things even more interesting, they add a text box for the user to enter their name.
Ooh, now we're talking data manipulation. Take the input, store it, use it to personalize the output.
Right. They use JavaScript to store the name in a variable.
Variables, those are like containers for information that the program can use later.
So instead of a generic hello, they tweak the code to include the user's name. Click the button, and it says, hello user's name.
Pretty neat, right?
It is. And while the specific JavaScript might be unfamiliar right now, those underlying concepts are universal to programming.
Those are the key takeaways here. Even with a simple example, we see the magic of programming in action. And it really drives home how a little code can create this whole personalized experience for the user.
It's like they're having a mini conversation, the person in the program.
Exactly. It's not just giving orders, it's about creating that interaction, that tailored response. That's what makes programming so cool, even from these basic examples.
It definitely gets you thinking about the possibilities.
For sure. And this deep dive has reminded me why I love programming so much. There's always something new to learn, always a challenge to solve. It never gets boring.
And that constant learning, that's part of the appeal, isn't it?
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, whether you're already coding like crazy or just starting out, we hope this deep dive is sparking some curiosity.
Maybe some fresh ideas, or even that push to take the next step in your own programming journey.
Because remember, there's a whole world out there in the programming universe, just waiting to be discovered.
Don't be afraid to try things, to make mistakes, and most importantly, to have fun with it.
That's key.
And hey, if you ever get stuck, remember what the webinar host said, Google is your friend.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? So are we.
Feel free to reach out, share those aha moments, any questions you have, even your coding wins, big or small.
We love hearing from our listeners, it's true.
We're all learning and growing together in this.
What stands out to you from all this?
For me, it's how much they emphasize logical thinking and problem solving. It's not just about writing code, it's about tackling those challenges in a systematic way.
Breaking things down, finding creative solutions, I agree.
And those real-life examples, the analogies, they really help bring those concepts to life.
They do, like comparing code to directions or a recipe, it makes it so much easier to understand.
Right. It's not about being a math whiz. It's about applying logic and creativity.
And the webinar makes it clear there are tons of resources out there to support you. Whether you go the formal education route or take the self-taught path, you're not alone.
Exactly. The key takeaway is that programming is for anyone willing to learn.
And it's a skill that's becoming more and more valuable, opening up all these opportunities.
Speaking of opportunities, the webinar ends with a thought-provoking question.
Oh, what is it?
They ask, if you were to create a simple program, what problem would it solve?
That's a good one. It really makes you think about how to apply these concepts in real life.
It gets those creative gears turning, doesn't it?
It does. It's amazing how one webinar can spark so much curiosity and get us thinking about all these potential applications for programming.
So we encourage you to ponder that question. What problem would you solve with code?
It could be something small and personal, or something with the potential to make a real impact.
No idea is too big or too small. That's the beauty of it.
With programming, you have the power to turn those ideas into reality.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive is the first step in your journey to becoming a programmer.
Or at the very least, it's given us a better appreciation for how code shapes our world.
Now, before we wrap up, don't forget to check out the show notes for links to all those resources we mentioned.
The games, the learning platforms, there's so much to explore.
And we hope you're feeling inspired to keep exploring the world of programming.
And remember, Google is your friend.
Experiment, ask questions, and most importantly, have fun.
Curiosity is key.
Until our next deep dive, keep those minds curious, those keyboards clicking, and let that creativity flow.
Happy coding, everyone!
And happy learning. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of programming.
That live coding example they do, it really ties everything together.
It's like a mini version of all the big ideas, condensed into a few lines of code.
Right. Even with just a butter, a message, and a name input, you see so much of programming's potential.
The user puts something in, the program does its magic, and boom, you get this personalized output.
It's like a little dialogue happening between the person and the computer.
It is. And that back and forth, that's what makes programming so fascinating, even in these simple forms.
It really opens up your mind to the possibilities of what you can create with code.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really reminded me why programming is so engaging.
Me too. There's always something new to learn, a new problem to tackle, and it's a field that's constantly pushing boundaries.
That continuous learning aspect, I think that's part of what makes it so appealing.
Definitely. So to everyone listening, whether you're a coding pro or just starting out, we hope this deep dive has piqued your interest.
Maybe it's given you some new perspectives, or even inspired you to take that next step on your own programming journey.
Remember, there's a whole world of possibilities within the programming universe just waiting to be explored.
Don't hesitate to experiment, make mistakes, and most importantly, have fun while you're learning.
That's key. And if you ever hit a roadblock, remember, Google is your friend.
Couldn't agree more. And hey, we're here too. Feel free to share your aha moments, your questions, even your coding victories, no matter how big or small.
We love hearing from our listeners and seeing what you're all creating.
It's all about learning and growing together.
So until next time, keep those minds curious, those keyboards clicking, and that creative spark alive.
Happy coding, everyone.
And happy learning.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the amazing world of programming.